But we also know that there have been infringements on free speech that actually affect not just the British. Of course, what the British do in their own country is up to them.
Let's go, JD. We're putting you on stage.
Great. Yeah, look, I said what I said, which is that we do have, of course, a special relationship with our friends in the UK and also with some of our European allies.
European leaders are now openly prosecuting citizens for the crime of praying silently. When JD Vance highlighted this shocking reality at the Munich Security Conference, you could watch Starmer physically recoil at having this inconvenient truth stated in an international forum. The panicked reaction from European establishments wasn't just defensive, it was textbook authoritarian. Rather than addressing the substance of Vance's criticisms, they've launched attacks on the messenger. This pattern of deflection reveals something far more concerning about the future of democracy in Europe. When JD Vance took the stage at the Munich Security Conference, he didn't just deliver a speech, he shattered an unspoken rule of international diplomacy. In a room filled with European political elites, the Ohio senator and Trump's running mate dared to question the democratic credentials of nations that consider themselves beacons of liberal democracy.
Well, no, I mean, certainly we wouldn't want to reach across US citizens, and we don't, and that's absolutely right. But in relation to free speech in the UK, I'm very proud of our history there.
We discussed all this.
In his remarks at the Munich Security Conference, Vice President Vance condemned free speech violations in the UK, particularly. Could you respond? What is your message?
I have an idea. We have the man right here. Come on.
His focus on the UK's criminalization of silent prayer struck at the heart of a growing contradiction in Western governance. The response was swift and revealing. Rather than addressing the substance of Vance's criticisms, European leaders and media outlets launched into what can only be described as a coordinated character assassination. Vance was immediately labeled an extremist, a dangerous populist, and an election conspiracist. The Guardian called his comments incendiary. The Times described them as inflammatory. Not a single major outlet bothered to examine whether his central claim that the UK is prosecuting citizens for silent prayer was actually true. This deflection strategy speaks volumes. When political establishments can't refute the message, they attack the messenger. It's a classic authoritarian tactic dressed up in the language of liberal democracy. The irony couldn't be more stark. European leaders responding to accusations of authoritarianism with authoritarian methods of discourse control. Keir Starmer's physical discomfort during the White House exchange with Vance wasn't merely diplomatic awkwardness, it was the visible manifestation of cognitive dissonance. Here was a man who has built his political brand on being a reasonable, moderate defender of liberal values, suddenly confronted with the uncomfortable reality of policies his government actively supports. The cameras caught more than embarrassment. They captured the tension of a politician caught between his carefully constructed public image and the actual governance record he must defend. The case of Adam Smith Connor perfectly illustrates what Vance was highlighting. This physiotherapist and British Army veteran was confronted by authorities for silently praying on a public street near an abortion facility in Bournemouth. When questioned about what he was doing, he honestly admitted he was praying for my son, who is deceased. For this thought crime, an internal, silent communication with his God about his aborted son, Smith Connor was issued a fine under buffer zone regulations. This wasn't an isolated incident. Isabel Vaughan Spruce, co-director of March for Life UK, was arrested twice for silently praying near an abortion facility in Birmingham. During police questioning, officers asked her specifically about the content of her thoughts and prayers. Let that sink in. British authorities interrogating a citizen about the content of her silent prayers. How is this substantively different from thought policing in regimes Western democracies routinely condemn? European leaders had a perfect opportunity to explain how such prosecutions align with their professed commitment to free expression. Instead, they chose collective outrage at Vance's rudeness for mentioning these inconvenient facts. Foreign Policy magazine called his speech a tirade. The Financial Times described it as an attack on European allies. Sky News labeled it a blast at NATO partners. The substance of his criticism went largely unaddressed. This pattern of deflection echoes precisely the authoritarian tendencies Vance highlighted. When confronted with evidence of government overreach, the standard response is to change the subject, attack the critic's character, or reframe the criticism as dangerous to society. It's a playbook we've seen repeatedly deployed against anyone questioning the expanding definition of hate speech or challenging the narrowing parameters of acceptable discourse. The mainstream media's coverage further reinforces this dynamic. Headlines focused almost exclusively on the supposed breach of diplomatic norms rather than examining whether European citizens' freedoms are indeed being eroded. The BBC emphasized the diplomatic row while skating past the actual policies in question. CNN framed the issue entirely around Vance's confrontational style rather than the substance of his claims. Why did Vance's comments about criminalized prayer in the UK hit such a nerve with Starmer? Because they exposed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of his political project. Starmer has positioned himself as a reasonable centrist defender of traditional liberal values while simultaneously overseeing an unprecedented expansion of speech restrictions. When these contradictions are pointed out publicly, especially by a prominent American politician, the cognitive dissonance becomes impossible to ignore. The growing distrust in European political institutions speaks volumes about the contradiction we're witnessing. Recent statistics confirm what Vance's speech exposed: a populace increasingly concerned about their free speech rights being chipped away by the very institutions claiming to protect them. This isn't merely about political posturing, it's about a fundamental crisis of legitimacy. When leaders respond to legitimate concerns about freedom with deflection rather than substantive defense, they reveal their inability to reconcile their actions with democratic principles. The nervous squirming we witnessed from Starmer reflects a deeper anxiety permeating European leadership circles. They recognize the growing disconnect between their public commitments and their restrictive policies. For citizens watching this unfold, the question becomes unavoidable. In a system where questioning government overreach brands you an extremist, what meaningful democracy remains? If those in power cannot honestly justify their limitations on fundamental freedoms, perhaps they've forfeited their moral authority to govern at all.